My parents said my leukemia treatment wasn't worth the money and chose my brother's future over my life. Now I'm taking them to court to save my life. My parents threw my brother Luke a 2-tier cake and 45 guests celebrating his spelling bee win when he was 10. After winning the science fair 2 weeks later, they forgot to pick me up from school, so I had to walk home with my trophy in the rain. That summed up my youth. Their 10-year search for a miracle child ended with Luke. After they had him, I was the accident. An expensive crib and hand-painted murals were his. Hand-me-down blankets and a dresser drawer. Clara packed his report cards, crayon drawings, and baby teeth in boxes. I trashed my stuff. My expectations had faded by age 10. I started self-care fully. Personally packed lunches, did laundry, and walked to school. Clara drove Luke even though we went the same place. While starting my 35-minute walk, I saw them leave. My backpack was full of babysitting purchased books. Teacher thought I was independent. I had no option. I hated how they gaslighted me. Clara said, "We love you both equally," at another Luke hockey game. Matthew told co-workers, "I hadn't seen her at any of my track meets all season." You're imagining things. Showing Luke's photos but not mine. A Luke shrine, trophies, certificates and photos from every age filled the living room. My fridge had a second-grade school photo. I entered advanced science at 16. Stanford summer camp full scholarship. Kids' dream chance. Letter in hand, I ran home. Finally, something large enough to care. Clara looked and said, "That's nice, but Luke has a baseball game that week so we can't drive you." The camp was 2.5 hours away. To give me a lifetime opportunity, she wouldn't miss his games. Thus I worked and saved every penny for college. I knew they'd never pay for mine. Clara constantly mentioned Luke's college fund. "We've saved $35,000 for his education," she boasted to family. Due to my bookishness, she said I'd probably get scholarships when those relatives asked about my college plans. Being smart compensated for being unloved. I got sick at 17. Bruises everywhere, exhaustion unbearable. Because complaining got me nowhere in that house, I ignored it for months. But when I fainted at work and woke up in the hospital, the tests showed advanced acute leukemia, so the doctors were surprised I was walking. My parents finally valued me. Clara slept in the hospital chair, cried, and held my hand during chemo. Since I was dying, Matthew took time off work, which he never did for school events. I got flowers, balloons, and teddy bears, everything I wanted as a kid but never got. Lovely parents loved me for 3 months. Chemo works. Counts rose. My doctors said I had a chance if we continued. It seemed like this illness had changed things. Almost losing me may have shown them my worth. Clara even praised my strength. Hearing 15-year-old words made me cry. Then Luke joined Harvard. Without scholarships or aid. He had poor grades. Clara promised to make his dream school work. She sat on my hospital bed the next day with that fake concern I knew too well. "Sweetie, we need to talk about your treatment costs. With Luke's tuition and insurance's limits." She told me they'd have to stop paying for my chemo after this round, and I stared. That Luke's education was an investment in the future while my treatment was going to prolong the inevitable, that I'd had a good life, and that I shouldn't be selfish about Luke's opportunities. She called my desire to avoid cancer so her favorite child could attend Harvard selfish. She promised, "We'll make you comfortable," generously. "Harvard accepts 1 student. You'll probably get cancer again." She casually said it, like she'd decided I was dead. Luke needed that money for spring break, dorm, and meals. I needed it to live, but never first. Mother, who'd held my hand during chemo just long enough to feel like she'd done her duty, sat there. Since Luke needed something, I was again expendable, even sacrificed. She expected me to understand that she was literally choosing his college experience over mine. I refused to surrender. I took my phone when Clara left. Shaky hands prevented me from unlocking the screen. The chemo pump beeped next to my bed as I searched for medical emancipation minor and read everything I could. When parents refused treatment, teens fought for their own health care. Legal definitions, patient rights laws and court-winning kids were screenshotted. I kept saving articles about minors seeking medical decision-making authority, even though the bright screen in the dark room burned my eyes. When I moved, the 4th grabbed my arm, but I didn't care. Every page I read gave me hope that I didn't have to accept dying because my parents prioritized Luke's dorm room over mine. When the sun rose through the hospital window, I had 24 screenshots and a basic understanding of legal medical neglect. A 6% phone battery made my eyes feel like sandpaper. I finally had a plan. During morning rounds at 7 o'clock, Dr. Grant saw my face and stopped in the doorway. He cautiously asked if home was okay, sensing a problem. I tried to hold back, but words flowed. Clara told me to stop my treatment after this round, about Luke and Harvard, and that my cancer would probably come back anyway, so why waste the money? From worried to angry, Dr. Grant's expression changed. A tight jaw made him forcefully drop his tablet on the counter. He asked me to repeat what she said, and I made him more upset with each word. He grabbed his phone and typed quickly after I finished. Tense. Dr. Collins said he was paging the hospital social worker and that I wouldn't be discharged until we exhausted all my care options. In the chair next to my bed, he clearly explained what would happen if we stopped treatment. The cancer responded well to chemo. Increasing cell counts. Entire protocol completion indicated remission. He called stopping halfway through medically catastrophic. He predicted a more aggressive leukemia return within months, reducing my chances of survival to 0. He insisted that we weren't delaying the inevitable like Clara claimed. After stopping a working treatment, I was condemned to death when I had every chance of survival. His flat, angry tone made everything seem more real than Clara's fake concern. Within an hour, Sophia Richards arrived. A tired-eyed 40-something woman with a no-nonsense walk. She brought a legal pad and introduced herself as the hospital social worker, then pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down like she had time. Something about her claim that she'd handled cases like mine convinced me. She asked me to explain my family history, everything before this. I finally had an adult who listened without interrupting or making excuses, just taking notes and nodding. The way she looked at me showed she believed everything I said, and wouldn't dismiss this as teenage drama or family disagreement. When I stopped, she asked about timing, patterns, and duration. The words came easier than expected when I told her everything. My science fair trophy that I carried home in the rain because they forgot to pick me up versus the spelling bee party with 45 guests and a 2-tier cake. Hand-painted murals in Luke's nursery versus my dresser drawer and hand-me-down blankets. Stanford summer camp was out because Clara wouldn't miss a baseball game to drive me 2.5 hours. The $35,000 college fund she boasted about for Luke while telling relatives I'd get scholarships because I was bookish. Sophia recorded it without facial expression, asking how old I was when things happened, how often they missed my events, and if anyone else saw the favoritism. She asked what changed when Luke got into Harvard and about the 3 months they showed up during chemo. I told them about the acceptance letter and Clara sitting on my hospital bed the next day to stop my treatment. Sophia set her pen down and explained that parents legally make medical decisions for minors, which I already knew from my research. She said there are emergency provisions for guardians who actively endanger a child's life. Her use of medical neglect made me sick because it meant accusing my parents of harming me. This required legalization, not just family strife. Sophia noticed my reaction and explained that medical neglect is about outcome, not intent. Denying a child life-saving treatment is neglect, regardless of the reason. Sophia stated, "The courts take these cases seriously because they involve a minor who can't advocate for themselves. Except I was advocating for myself now, and she was going to help me do it properly." Sophia began making a list on her phone. My medical history from diagnosis to current treatment, the full treatment protocol, and Dr. Grant's medical opinion on what happens if chemo stops. She also contacted the hospital ethics committee because life or death decision-making was used against a patient's wishes. The ethics committee could advise family court on my parents' medical neglect. Because of the deadline, she said this would happen in days, not weeks. I needed legal clarity before my next chemo cycle, which was getting closer every day. She asked me if I wanted to proceed because it would get messy and my parents would know I went to the hospital staff. Because the alternative was dying and I'd spent 15 years being the kid nobody fought for, I told her I was sure that I should fight for myself. So I texted Luke to come visit me without our parents to see where he stood in all this. I pondered the message before sending. What I wanted from his answer was unclear. Some part of me hoped he'd be horrified by Clara's words and offer loans or defer enrollment. Some expected him to join them like he always did and explain why his education was more important than my life. Although the message was delivered, he didn't respond. I stared at my phone for a while, but I realized it wouldn't make him answer faster. Distracting myself with bad daytime TV took 3 hours. He finally answered my phone, saying he'd come after his part-time grocery store shift. Expect him around 7 o'clock. Though brief, the message gave me no indication of his thoughts, but he was coming. Late afternoon, Dr. Grant returned with a folder and a sad face. He gave Sophia several pages of typed medical documentation on hospital letterhead. He wrote my prognosis in court-like language. I had a 60% 4-year survival rate if we finished the protocol, so 6 out of 10 patients like me would survive. Stopping treatment reduced that number to 15% in 2 years, under 1.5 out of 10 would qualify. Seeing the numbers in black and white changed everything. Treatment was valued by more than Dr. Grant. It proved mathematically that my parents put me in the 15% group instead of the 60%. Sophia carefully read the pages, highlighting yellow sections. She looked up and said this documentation was exactly what we needed, that no judge could use these numbers to say my parents made a reasonable medical decision. Someone from hospital billing arrived before dinner. A nervous-looking tablet-wielding man who requested my account audit. He displayed numbers and codes that I didn't understand until he converted them to dollars. My treatment had cost over $35,000, which put my brain on pause because I couldn't imagine such a large bill. Insurance covered $28,000, leaving my parents with $7,000 in copays and deductibles. For the remaining cycles, insurance would likely cover $20,000 and leave $8,000 out of pocket. Basically, my parents refused to pay $8,000. They saved $8,000 for Luke's college fund. As the billing guy talked about payment plans and financial assistance programs, all I could think about was how Clara's morally disgusting choice suddenly made terrible financial sense. She didn't pick $35,000 or my life. It was too much for the kid she never wanted, so she chose my life over $8,000. The next few hours were spent alone with those numbers in my head, trying to figure out how my life had become a math problem my parents couldn't solve. My stomach was in knots, so I pushed the plastic tray of dinner around without eating. Wall clock read 6:47 p.m. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and Luke appeared in the doorway looking exhausted. He looked older than 19 with wrinkled work clothes and dark circles under his eyes. He entered and sat in the chair beside my bed, staring at his hands like he didn't know what to do. He shouted that he'd told Clara he'd take out Harvard student loans, so she didn't have to use the college fund if it meant stopping my treatment. I felt my chest loosen briefly before he continued. She flatly refused. Said the loans would ruin his credit and future. I said I was overdramatic anyway. Clara thinks the treatment won't work, so why waste money on a chance at success? Luke's voice cracked and his hands shook when he repeated her words. I asked him directly if his college was more important than my life. The question hovered between us like a physical. He began to cry as he explained that he didn't know what to do. Clara controlled his every decision. He chose classes, activities, and friends. Told him his true identity. He was afraid to disappoint them, but he knew what they were doing to me was wrong, and being caught between them was tearing him apart. I wanted to feel sorry for him, but I was tired because he was still making this about himself rather than my survival. After wiping his face with his sleeve, he started talking faster, telling me about our family's finances. Matthew's business had lost clients to larger companies for 2 years and barely made enough to cover expenses. Bills kept piling up, including credit card debt and a second mortgage on the house. After borrowing for emergency repairs and medical bills from Matthew's health scare last year, the college fund was $30,000 instead of $35,000. Hearing all this explained why they were panicking about money, but it didn't change the fact that they were letting me die instead of solving the problem. Luke kept saying that being broke allowed them to sacrifice one kid for the other. After I told him that many families had money problems and didn't kill their children, he flinched like I'd hit him. Sophia came in with a folder after knocking on the doorframe, breaking the awkward silence. She read the room's tension by looking at Luke and me. She requested that Luke write a statement about the family's favoritism and neglect from childhood. He hesitated, and I could see him struggling with the idea of writing against our parents before a court. But he nodded and said he'd write down everything he'd seen since we were kids, always choosing him over me or forgetting I existed. Sophia gave him paperwork and a pen. Asked him to remember dates and events specifically. Sophie sat down and we discussed what would happen after Luke left with the papers under his arm. She said she had been calling all afternoon to prepare for our legal steps. I had resources and support that most kids in my situation didn't because the hospital supported me. After Sophia left and the nurses finished their rounds, I stared at the ceiling and tried not to think. When my bedside table phone rang at 9 o'clock, I knew it was Clara without looking. Since I was too tired to turn it off, I let it ring until it went to voicemail and listened to her voice through the speaker. She accused me of manipulating everyone and destroying Luke's future out of jealousy because I'd always hated him for being the favorite. She advised me to accept reality and stop upsetting the family. Making them look bad to the hospital and involving social workers was just spite. She was angry, but her voice may have been hiding fear, like she knew she'd done wrong but couldn't admit it. After her voicemail ended, I deleted it without saving it and turned off the phone's ringer to prevent her from calling. That night I had trouble sleeping and dreamed about drowning while people watched from the shore. Weak sunlight from the hospital window and nurses checking my vitals and bringing me breakfast I couldn't eat started the day. Sophia arrived around 8 with coffee and determination. A 30-year-old man in a professional, affordable suit accompanied her. David Collins, a legal aid attorney specializing in child and medical rights cases, was introduced. He shakes my hand and sits down with Sophia's folder, carefully reading and taking notes on a yellow legal pad. He looked up after 20 minutes and said we needed an emergency court case. Because this was happening, my heart raced. In court we would fight my parents over my life. David explained the entire process without patronizing me or simplifying it. We'd file for temporary medical decision-making authority from my parents to the hospital while we worked on something bigger. We'd push for limited healthcare choices until I turned 18 in 5 months, which wasn't full adult rights, but let me choose my treatment. Because it was life or death, he said it would move fast. The judges took these cases seriously when a child's life was at stake. Everything was moving faster than expected because the hospital ethics group scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day. That afternoon, Emily Carter from the ethics group interviewed me alone without Sophia, David, or doctors. With gray hair and kind eyes, she was probably 50 and asked me detailed questions about the treatment and what would happen if I stopped it. She asked if the doctors were forcing me or if I chose to continue. She seemed to be testing my maturity to make this decision. Because my parents stopped raising me, I told her I'd been making my own choices since I was 10. Choosing what to eat, when to sleep, and how to get to school. The only difference was that this choice would determine my fate, not just my clothes or lunch. Emily wrote everything down and asked more questions about my parents, Luke, and illness. When she asked what my future looked like, I was shocked to realize I hadn't thought past next month. Survival felt impossible, so planning beyond it seemed pointless. I told her I wanted to finish high school, maybe go to community college, get a job I didn't hate, and let go of fighting for attention from people who were supposed to love me. When I said it, it sounded like the bare minimum of a life. It was more than I previously hoped for. My parents unexpectedly arrived that afternoon, and I heard their voices down the hallway before I saw them. Before reaching my room, their older gray-suited lawyer began discussing parental rights and family privacy. Because Sophia caught them outside my door, she must have been watching. Then 3 adults started arguing louder. Clara called me difficult, and the lawyer said they had every right to make medical decisions for their minor child as I sat frozen in my hospital bed. Sophia stated calmly that the hospital was investigating medical neglect, and that an ethics review was underway. After the lawyer threatened lawsuits and overreach, their voices moved down the hall until I couldn't hear them. A few angry sounds that tightened my chest. The nurse checked my vitals 20 minutes later. Sandra, my week-long caregiver. First she adjusted my IV silently, then she glanced at the closed door and spoke. She claimed to have seen this. A kid's serious illness was too much for parents to handle financially, emotionally, or physically. Some of them believed giving up was mercy, sparing their child from suffering when they were really sparing themselves from fighting. She stared at me when she said it wasn't my job to help them choose by dying when it was convenient. Nobody had said so clearly that my parents wanted the easy way out and expected me to cooperate. Sandra completed my IV and left without saying anything else, but I kept thinking about what she said while staring at my phone. Luke sent me a slow-loading photo at 6 p.m. It arrived with 3 pages of handwritten lined paper. I could read part of his Sophia statement on the phone. I missed every birthday party. Every school event missed. When they chose him over me, his words were messy, like he was writing fast or shaking. Finally, he wrote that he regretted never defending me. If necessary, he'd testify. After saving the photo, I sat with my phone, uncertain how to feel about my brother seeing my life. Despite the quiet hospital and chemo exhaustion, I couldn't sleep that night. I thought about court, lawyers, and proving my parents neglected me. Making strangers believe I was worth saving. I gave up on sleep at 2 a.m. and opened my phone's notes app. I began documenting everything. How being the unwanted kid felt. Walking home alone while Luke drove. Using babysitting money for school supplies. It rained on the science fair trophy. Stanford camp I missed. Start packing lunches in 4th grade. The living room Luke shrine. And my old fridge photo. I documented every forgotten birthday, track meet, and time they prioritized his hockey game over whatever I needed. I wrote quickly after starting. Factual, not angry, like I was documenting something that was always true but nobody recognized. When weak morning light broke through my window, I had 5 pages of single-spaced notes, 15 years of being second choice organized into clear patterns. Like I was suing my parents. It felt weird. Sophia requested documentation, and I provided it. Later that day, Sophia told me about the ethics committee meeting, sitting in my bedside chair with a tired smile. She said they unanimously supported the emergency petition because the medical neglect and endangerment evidence was clear. Because this was life or death timing, Emily called the family court judge to expedite the hearing, and he agreed to schedule it in days instead of weeks. Sophia squeezed my hand and told me I was doing great and that speaking up for myself took courage most adults lacked. Because this was happening, I was scared rather than relieved. Taking my parents to court. Sophia presented my parents' lawyer's overnight counter motion the next morning, and I was so mad I couldn't see straight. Their lawyer said hospital staff wanted to up treatment charges. Doctors were using me to make money, and my parents were making a reasonable decision based on financial constraints. I felt slapped when Dr. Grant and Sophia were accused of using me. They had fought harder for my life than my parents. Multiple times Dr. Grant stayed late to adjust my treatment. Sophia helped me navigate systems she didn't care about for hours. Some lawyer called them manipulative because they wanted me to live. Rate me 5 stars on Spotify after 90 seconds. Giving away to Instagram proof bearers. 4 winners will receive Spotify or Amazon gift cards. When David arrived later that day, he barely responded except to say that desperate people make desperate arguments. He took out his yellow legal pad and worked me through court practice questions, teaching me to stay calm and factual, even when the other lawyer tried to confuse me. He said judges constantly saw manipulation and that my consistent story across multiple witnesses would be my strongest evidence. His tough questions about my relationship with my parents and my learning to answer without crying or defending took over an hour. I felt better prepared by the end but still terrified of doing this for real. The next afternoon, Charlotte brought a large tote bag and dumped it on my bed. Inside were a phone charger, bags of my favorite snacks, 3 magazines, and a card with signatures all over it. She said all the restaurant employees had signed it and raised $300 for my treatment. Though it wasn't much, I cried anyway because people who barely knew me and had worked shifts with me for a few months cared more about my survival than my parents. Charlotte hugged me while I cried and told me the staff was rooting for me and wanted to help. She stayed for 2 hours talking about work gossip and the worst managers, taking my mind off court, cancer, and parents who wanted me gone. I changed out of my hospital gown 3 days after Clara's announcement and David drove me to the courthouse, an old brick building downtown that smelled like wood polish and anxiety. I was surprised by the hearing room's size, just a judge's desk and rows of chairs. Although I could see Clara's face, she didn't look at me as my parents and their lawyer sat across the aisle from me and David. Matthew looked at his hands, and Sophia advised Luke to stay out unless they needed him to testify. The judge entered. We stood up, sat down, and it began. Dr. Grant testified first, walking up with a thick folder of my medical records. He explained that my leukemia was responding well to treatment but that stopping now would kill me within months in simple, understandable terms. He showed charts showing my blood counts improving and explained the remaining treatment cycles. He stated that following the protocol increased my chances of long-term survival. Dr. Grant quickly dismissed my parents' lawyer's claim that the cancer might return, saying that was true of any cancer patient but not a reason to stop treating someone who was responding to treatment. Sophia took the stand next and opened a thick folder with everything she'd collected this week. Her interviews with me, Luke, and nurses who'd seen my parents disappear when Harvard came in were detailed. She read Luke's 3-page statement about every birthday party I missed, school event they skipped, and time they picked him over me since we were kids. She presented my 5-page documentation. The accident they never wanted for 15 years. You could see courtroom attendees shifting. She clearly outlined the pattern, making my parents' lawyer uncomfortable. This history of neglect before cancer was life-threatening. Before the judge, evidence covered the table. Pages showing I'd raised myself since 10 while they poured everything into Luke. My parents' attorney testified that they'd been there throughout my treatment, that Clara had slept in hospital chairs and Matthew had taken time off work. He noted that they'd attended chemo appointments for 2 months, shedding 15 years. David stood up and asked a simple question that cut through everything. He wondered why care stopped when Luke's college plans needed money. Why they only cared about my life when it competed with their favorite child's dreams. The lawyer found no satisfactory response. Repeated that they were there when it counted. However, David stated that I would not be fighting for treatment in court if it mattered. The judge told me to testify, and my legs shook as I walked to the front. She directly asked what I wanted, and I spoke less than I meant. I said I wanted to live, finish the working treatment, and stop because my cancer was getting better and stopping would kill me in months. My parents couldn't afford it, I told her. That shouldn't mean I had to die. There are other options besides giving up on me. I stared at the judge because looking at Clara and Matthew was impossible, and I could feel tears coming, but I had to sound strong enough to be saved. My parents were asked if they had considered payment plans, charity care, Medicaid, fundraising, or anything other than stopping treatment. Matthew said they hadn't because insurance denial meant no other options. And the judge's face showed her opinion of that answer. She asked why they hadn't contacted hospital financial counselors or researched aid. Why they let their daughter die to solve a money problem. Clara stared at her hands as Matthew said nothing. Clara finally spoke up, shaking, arguing that she was protecting me from false hope and making my last months comfortable instead of painful. She didn't sound convinced, the words coming out wrong, like she was reading a script she never understood. Judge leaned forward and asked her directly if she was prioritizing her son's education over her daughter's life. Nothing came out of Clara's mouth, and silence answered everything better than words. She was trying to explain how sacrificing one child for another was good parenting. But there wasn't, and we knew. Without pause, the judge ruled. The hospital received temporary emergency authority to continue my treatment while the full emancipation petition was processed. My parents were ordered to complete Medicaid applications and charity care reviews to provide the hospital with financial documents. The court took away their right to let me die so I could keep getting chemo. I stopped breathing when David squeezed my shoulder. Heavy relief made me dizzy. Clara tried to approach me as she left the courthouse, but David stopped her. He reminded her that the order prohibited harassment and pressure, so she should stay back and let me leave without controversy. Behind her, Matthew looked defeated. He slumped like someone had knocked out his fight. Luke lingered near the courthouse doors, wanting to say something but unsure what would help. David led me past them to his car without looking back because I didn't trust myself not to break down if I looked back. Sophia met us in her hospital office with a 3-inch stack of Medicaid paperwork. She explained we needed to prove my parents couldn't or wouldn't provide emergency care as a medically needy minor. We had to provide income, assets, household composition, and medical neglect documentation on the forms. Sophia showed me how to sign and what she'd learned from the court proceedings in each section. Signing my name over and over cramped my hand, proving I was alone. Dr. Grant stopped by to schedule my next chemo cycle for 2 days while we finished the paperwork. In my case, the hospital's charity care committee would consider financial assistance to fill Medicaid gaps. He seemed relieved that treatment could continue, like he'd finally put down my chance of death. As my counts improved, he told me I'd finish the full protocol around graduation and possibly walk across the stage to receive my diploma if we stayed on track. Luke arrived at my hospital room that night and we sat in silence, unsure how to start a conversation after court. He told Harvard he was delaying enrollment for a year to work and save money before college. Although he tried to make it sound practical, we both knew what it meant. He was leaving the situation that nearly killed me. Knowing I died for Harvard, he couldn't attend. I kept thinking about the chemo I wouldn't have gotten without the court's intervention in those classes. I wanted to tell him he didn't have to compromise his future to apologize. Perhaps he needed to do this for himself, to know he'd chosen differently from our parents when it mattered. I told Luke he didn't have to sacrifice his future to prove something and could still go to Harvard if he preferred. He shook his head and said he'd looked into state schools with better financial aid, so maybe this was better for everyone in the long run. Knowing Harvard tuition nearly killed me, he couldn't sit in those classes. This weight prevented me from enjoying the experience. My desire to argue was tempered by my realization that I'd carried undeserved guilt for 15 years. I knew his expression. Charlotte arrived the next morning with a stack of folders and a determined face, explaining that she'd talked to my teachers about remote learning so I could finish senior year from the hospital. She had my next month's assignments printed and study guides from my classmates. She then showed me a calendar of co-workers who offered to drive me to appointments, restaurant employees who barely knew me but wanted to help. She built a support system from scratch, filling holes my parents left with uncaring people. I saw actual support in that calendar with 12 names and felt something open in my chest. Sophia informed us 2 weeks after the court hearing that the Medicaid application was expedited, covering most of my treatment costs and some of our past bills. Medical neglect documentation made my case a priority for emergency services, she said, and the system moved faster when a minor was endangered. We were looking at Medicaid and hospital coverage fully funding my treatment without a penny from my parents. I was dizzy with relief because for the first time since Clara's announcement, I thought I might survive. A formal letter from my parents' lawyer requesting supervised visitation arrived 3 days later. Many references to reconciling and repairing our relationship. David came over that evening to review it with me and told me I could set my own boundaries and not see them until I was ready. I thought about it for 30 seconds before telling him I wasn't ready and needed time to focus on treatment without managing their emotions. Yes, he'd tell their attorney that my healing came first. Sophia called me the following week to say the hospital charity committee had approved coverage for my remaining out-of-pocket costs. After reviewing my court documents and finances, she explained how Medicaid covered most of my treatment and charity care covered medications and additional testing. System designed to protect kids whose families failed them, funded my cancer treatment without my parents' money. I pondered that for a long time, trying to believe I'd done it and won my own survival. When my next chemo cycle began, I felt awful. Even though the nausea and exhaustion were worse than before, I was stronger emotionally than in months. I demanded this treatment, not because anyone loved or owed me. Part of me still wanted parents to fight for me instead of making me fight alone, so independence was lonely. No one could take my survival or use it as leverage. Luke began visiting me every Thursday night after his grocery store shift, and we'd talk about his co-workers and my remote classes in my hospital room. We were slowly rebuilding something else. Not sibling love, but not hostile. Find a balance where our parents' choices don't weigh us down. He shared his plans to apply to community colleges and find full-time work without Harvard or Clara's input. After realizing we were both learning to live without our parents, I realized we were both discovering who we were. David filed the formal petition for limited medical emancipation a month after the emergency hearing, giving me legal authority to make healthcare decisions until I turned 18 in 5 months. To give everyone time to prepare, the hearing was scheduled 6 weeks out, but he expected it to go well since my parents weren't contesting, and we had strong documentation. I needed the petition to complete my legal protection after the emergency order expired. While David explained each section, I signed the papers in his office. Writing my signature repeatedly cramped my hand. Dr. Grant excitedly reviewed my latest blood work at my next appointment, explaining that my cancer markers were improving faster than expected. He adds, "If this trajectory held, I'd complete treatment in about 4 months with an excellent prognosis for long-term remission." Hearing that I might survive and have years instead of months made me realize I needed to start planning for a future I'd never imagined. I was so focused on getting through each day that I hadn't considered what kind of life I wanted after cancer. That night in my hospital bed, I thought about college applications, career options, and who I could become if I could. The school counselor called the next week and we had a video meeting to discuss completing senior year with online classes and hospital tutoring. She scheduled weekly check-ins and had teachers send assignments electronically to keep me on track. Despite missing months of in-person attendance, I'd graduate on time in June and walk across that stage like nothing had happened. Being able to plan beyond survival felt revolutionary, like I could finally imagine a future with me. The following afternoon, Charlotte brought her laptop and a list of remote job sites. She sat next to my hospital bed and helped me fill out data entry application forms, without making employers nervous about my availability. Most of my work experience was waitressing at her restaurant, so my resume was pretty thin when we spent 2 hours filling out applications and uploading it. She repeatedly reminded me that any income was better than none, and that many companies hired remote workers because they needed flexible people when I got frustrated. By nightfall, I'd applied to 12 companies. Customer service chat and medical billing data entry. A medical records company emailed me 3 days later offering part-time work entering patient data into their database. I felt like I was building something for myself, instead of just surviving. The pay was minimum wage and I could only work 15 hours a week due to treatment. But it was mine. While awaiting my next blood test, I signed the contract on my phone. Feeling like I won something important despite winning a basic data entry job most people don't want. David called a week later to say my parents' lawyer wanted mediation before the emancipation hearing. Mediation was voluntary, and I could refuse, but it could show the judge that I want to keep in touch with them. During one of our weekly check-ins, Sophia offered to supervise the session if I did. It made my stomach hurt to sit with my parents, but I knew I couldn't avoid them forever, especially with Luke still living at home and trying to navigate between us. I contracted for one session with the understanding that Sophia would stay and I could leave whenever I wanted. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday in a small hospital conference room, neutral territory where I felt safer than anywhere else. The morning of mediation, I vomited twice from non-chemo nerves. Sophia walked in with me from outside the conference room, her hand on my shoulder like protection without control. With Sophia beside me, I took the seat across from Clara and Matthew, who were already sitting with their lawyer. Like we were breathing different oxygen, the air was thick and wrong. Their lawyer started with a formal statement about everyone being here in good faith to heal the family, but I was too focused on Clara's face to hear it. She looked older than I remembered, exhausted beyond being tired from sleep. I nearly felt sorry for her. She was sitting on my hospital bed telling me Luke's dorm room was more important than my life. Sympathy vanished. Clara started crying before being asked to speak. As she apologized for her poor handling, tears fell. She said she was terrified when I got sick, overwhelmed by medical bills, insurance fights, and chemo. Her struggle, months of insomnia, and feeling drowning in impossible choices were described. Her pain, fear, and struggle with my illness were the focus of every sentence. She recognized her mistakes, but she wanted me to understand how terrified she was, and how the pressure of keeping our family afloat had crushed her. Sitting there, she told my cancer about her suffering. I realized she wanted comfort. She requested forgiveness without acknowledging that she'd let me die so Luke could attend his dream school. She needed me to say I understood and we could be a family again. She never said what mattered, never admitted she'd chosen Luke over me. Never admitted that her financial panic nearly killed me. Matthew quietly stared at his hands while Clara cried and justified. On their lawyer's last request, he cleared his throat and said they'd made terrible decisions out of panic and desperation. He admitted to watching me fight for my life. Seeing me hire a lawyer, go to court, and refuse to die quietly made him realize how much my parents failed me. I could tell he meant it from his cracked voice, which made it worse. If he saw they'd failed me and could say so, why hadn't he stopped it? Why had it taken me nearly dying and fighting them in court for him to recognize Luke and my lifelong commitment? The closest I'd gotten from either of them to accountability, but it felt hollow because it came too late after I'd saved myself. I waited for them to finish talking before telling them I doubted I could ever be their parent. I agreed to supervised contact if they respected my boundaries and stopped trying to control my medical decisions, but I needed them to understand I might never trust them again. They'd shown me I didn't matter for 15 years. Even 3 months of hospitalization during cancer treatment didn't erase that. I told them emancipation wasn't punishment, it was about protecting myself from people who consistently sacrificed me when convenient. Clara looked devastated, her face crumpling like I'd hurt her. However, she nodded and accepted my limits. Matthew said he understood and respected my choices. Their lawyer recorded our limited supervised contact agreement. Session ended. I left feeling exhausted, like I'd run a marathon nobody saw. 6 weeks later, a cold March morning saw the full emancipation hearing. The nicest clothes I owned weren't saying much, and David met me outside the courthouse to review everything finally. He told me my parents wouldn't contest the petition and that their lawyer had filed a statement supporting my medical decisions and cooperating with my care. Not enough. Too late. Strange cooperation after months of fighting, but it meant we wouldn't have to face a judge again. We entered the courtroom and saw my parents in the back row, not at the defendant's table. Luke nodded to me when I returned. Elderly with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, the judge was different from the emergency hearing judge. Compared to the emergency petition, the hearing was brief and boring. David presented our medical records, treatment plans, and financial arrangements to prove I could manage my own health care. According to their lawyer, my parents supported the petition and respected my medical autonomy. I told the judge I'd been taking care of myself for most of my life when he asked me about my understanding of the responsibility. It became legal. She reviewed the paperwork for what seemed like forever, then granted limited medical emancipation effective immediately and lasting until my 18th birthday in 5 months. At that point, I'd have full adult rights, she said. However, this gave me legal standing. She then looked at me and said I'd shown more maturity and self-advocacy than many adults in her courtroom and hoped I'd continue to fight for myself with the same strength. Thanks to her, I left the courthouse free to make medical decisions. No more relying on parents who'd let me down. With legal authority and Medicaid and charity care funding, I could finally focus on chemo without fighting for it. Still, the physical effects hurt. Nausea, exhaustion, and hair loss made me feel betrayed by my body. I managed when I wasn't fighting my family. Without worrying about funding or stopping my care, I could focus on surviving each treatment cycle. I was able to eat most days after Dr. Grant adjusted my anti-nausea medications. I was now known by name and the nurses brought me warm blankets without asking. Kind gestures that reminded me not everyone was out to hurt me. I started recording my symptoms and side effects, including what helped and hurt. Taking charge of my treatment in a way that empowered me. Sophia worked with a program for medically complex teens to find me a small apartment 10 minutes from the hospital where I could live independently with case management. Furniture and rent were provided, and a social worker checked in twice a week to make sure I was okay. On a Saturday, my parents deliberately left their home. Our pre-planned trip to visit relatives allowed us to pack without conflict. Luke came early with his car and we packed my belongings into boxes quickly because I'd never accumulated much. 2 boxes held my clothes, 3 stored my books, and a backpack held my personal items. We mostly worked silently. Our past weighed on us. He carried boxes to his car while I looked around the room where I'd felt invisible for 15 years. Nothing was valuable here. Nobody I wanted to remember. Luke took me to the new apartment and helped me unpack, setting up my bed and books on the small shelf. Hugged me before leaving. Hugged me and apologized for not protecting me as a child. I then told him we were just surviving and didn't blame him for our parents' choices. He left and I sat in my new apartment, finally independent and permanent. My next to last chemo cycle ended 2 weeks after moving into the apartment, and Dr. Grant was excited to review my blood work. My counts were good, so I'd finish treatment around graduation in June if this continued. The timeline was strange. Thinking I could walk across that stage and get my diploma like a normal person. Even when I was too sick to sit up, I kept up with online classes and hospital tutoring. My teachers were understanding about extensions and modified workload, but I refused to accept pity grades for not doing the work. To confirm my graduation on time, the school counselor called and asked if I wanted to attend the ceremony. I agreed immediately because I deserved to wear that cap and gown to prove I survived. Clara and Matthew started attending supervised visits every other Tuesday at the hospital where Sophia had a special office. We'd talk about weather, Matthew's work projects, Clara's book club, anything that didn't require emotional honesty and uncomfortable chairs around a small table. I gave superficial answers about blood counts and side effects to their health questions. Harvard, Luke's college plans, and the court hearing that stripped them of medical authority over me were not mentioned. The visits lasted exactly 1 hour, and we left civilly without healing. Even though it meant keeping them at arm's length forever, stable was better than fighting. Sophia took notes during every visit. She sometimes watched Clara like a clinical specimen. After 6 weeks of these meetings, I realized this pattern might be permanent, that I'd reached my parents' maximum closeness, and wondered if limited contact was better than none. Cut them off completely felt like letting them win, like proving I was disposable like they'd always treated me. One Thursday afternoon, Luke texted me life-changing news. The state university accepted him with a partial academic scholarship that covered half his tuition, which was surprising given his grades. For housing savings, he planned to study business and live with our parents while I moved out. When he visited my apartment that weekend to tell me, he looked lighter and less tense around his shoulders. He said rejecting Harvard felt terrible at first but then relieved, like he'd been carrying unnecessary weight. I realized our parents kept crushing him in different ways, making him their success story whether he wanted it or not. Instead of his usual Harvard enthusiasm, he was excited about his classes and internship plans. Watching him decide what he wanted different from what they wanted reminded me that we were both surviving the same house with different strategies. After feeling mostly okay all day, I cleared space on the small bookshelf near my window one quiet evening in my apartment. First I set up my 10-year-old science fair trophy, which I carried home in the rain when nobody came to get me. I kept my Stanford summer program acceptance letter in its envelope next to it, even though I never went. My emancipation hearing documents were added next. Judge-signed documents proving I won my life by fighting for it. All 3 of these things told my story, proving I was worth fighting for, even when I had to fight. I stepped back and examined this shrine to my survival. A far cry from my parents' living room, Luke's shrine. Mine celebrated times I saved myself instead of waiting for others. So that's it. Another story to discuss, nothing serious.